Sarah Collins, a police officer, stepped out of the precinct into the crisp morning air, feeling the coolness of the day as the sun began to rise. The early light stretched long shadows across the quiet streets, painting everything in soft hues of gold and orange. Sarah took a deep breath, the weight of her badge pressing against her chest, a constant reminder of her duty and commitment to keeping the community safe. She adjusted her police cap and slid into her patrol car, mentally running through her checklist for the day. Everything had to be perfect. Rules were rules, and she prided herself on following them meticulously. As she started the engine and pulled out onto the street, Sarah's eyes scanned the sidewalks and storefronts, ever vigilant. "Another day, another dollar," she muttered to herself, her voice tinged with a hint of weariness. The neighborhood was quiet, and she had a lot of ground to cover. As she drove through the area, she noticed a group of teenagers loitering outside a convenience store. They were chatting and laughing, not causing any trouble, but their presence made Sarah uneasy. Loitering was against city ordinances, and she believed in keeping things orderly. She slowed the car and called out the window, "Move along." Her voice was stern, and the teenagers looked at her with surprise and annoyance before shuffling away, muttering under their breaths. Sarah felt a twinge of satisfaction. She was doing her job, enforcing the rules and maintaining order in what she saw as a chaotic world. Further down the street, she spotted an elderly man struggling with grocery bags. For a moment, Sarah considered stopping to help him, but then she shook her head. Helping people wasn't her job. She was there to enforce the law. As the morning wore on, Sarah found herself growing increasingly irritated by the minor infractions she observed. A jaywalker here, a car parked slightly over the line there. It seemed like everywhere she looked, people were bending or breaking the rules. "Don't they understand?" she thought. "These rules are here for a reason. If everyone just followed them, everything would be so much easier." By lunchtime, Sarah had handed out 3 tickets and given countless warnings. She felt tired but also righteous, believing she was doing her part to keep the community in line. As she pulled into the parking lot of a local diner for her lunch break, she caught sight of her reflection in the rearview mirror. She saw a woman dedicated to her job, committed to upholding the law, but also a hardness in her eyes that she didn't quite recognize. For just a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. Was she being too rigid? Too unforgiving? She quickly pushed the thought aside. She was doing what was right, following the rules just as everyone should. After her shift ended, Sarah made her way to the local grocery store. The fluorescent lights inside were a stark contrast to the dimming evening outside. She grabbed a basket and began to wander the aisles, scanning the shelves for the items on her mental list. As she turned into the cereal aisle, something caught her attention. A young black girl was standing there, looking lost and confused. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she watched the girl pick up a box, study it intently, and then put it back with shaky hands. What's she up to? Sarah thought, her police instincts kicking in even though she was off duty. The girl, who Sarah later learned was named Sophie Bennett, moved slowly down the aisle, her eyes darting around nervously. To Sarah, it looked suspicious. The girl's behavior seemed to signal something wrong, even though she hadn't actually done anything improper. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to where her badge would be, though she knew she wasn't on duty. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She pretended to study the nutrition facts on a box of bran flakes while keeping Sophie in her peripheral vision. Sophie picked up another box and held it close to her face, as if she were having trouble reading the label. Sarah's suspicion grew stronger. Was Sophie looking for security cameras or planning to shoplift? Sarah watched as Sophie moved to the next aisle, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a can of soup. In Sarah's mind, this was textbook suspicious behavior. However, what Sarah didn't know was that Sophie and her father, Mr. Samuel Bennett, had entered the grocery store earlier that evening. Mr. Bennett, a respected businessman, was there to inspect the store for potential renovations. He had left Sophie near the front of the store, promising to return quickly. "I'll just be a few minutes, sweetheart," he had said with a gentle smile. "Why don't you look around while you wait?" Sophie had nodded, trying to hide her nervousness. She wasn't used to being in unfamiliar places alone, but she didn't want to disappoint her father. As Sarah's world started to collide with Sophie's, the encounter was about to take a dramatic turn, one that could change Sarah's perspective forever. Sophie had been wandering around the store, waiting for Mr. Bennett, who had gone off with the store manager. The store was a big, bustling place filled with colorful displays and neatly stacked shelves. At first, she enjoyed looking at all the bright items and the organized rows. But soon, the store became overwhelming. The lights were too bright, and the chatter of other customers was too loud. Sophie's heart began to race as she realized she had lost her way. She turned down one aisle, then another, but everything looked the same. The labels on the products seemed to blur together, making it hard for her to focus. This is a gripping narrative, exploring Sarah's dedication to the law and the tension between strict rule enforcement and compassion. Sophie picked up various items just to have something to do, but her hands shook as she tried to read the ingredients on a cereal box. The words seemed to swim before her eyes. She felt a rising panic in her chest. "Where am I?" she thought. "Where's Dad?" She moved faster through the store, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. She barely noticed the concerned looks from other customers as she passed them. Her eyes darted around frantically, searching for any sign of her father. The store seemed to stretch endlessly before her, and she couldn't remember which direction she had come from. Tears pricked at her eyes as she clutched a can of soup, her hands trembling. "Dad," she whispered, her voice lost in the busy store. "Where are you?" Sarah, a store employee, was watching Sophie closely. She had noticed Sophie's erratic movements and nervous demeanor and became suspicious. Sarah observed as Sophie picked up items only to put them back, her hands visibly shaking. To Sarah, it all seemed like the behavior of a potential shoplifter. The constant wandering, the fidgeting with products, and the darting glances looked suspicious. Sarah took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and walked purposefully toward Sophie. Her hand brushed against her hip where her badge rested, a habit from years on the force. "Excuse me," Sarah called out, her voice sharp and authoritative. Sophie jumped at the sudden address, nearly dropping the can she was holding. She turned to face Sarah, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. Sarah's tone was immediately accusatory. "What exactly are you doing here? You've been wandering these aisles for quite some time now." Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her hands trembled even more as she clutched the can tighter to her chest. Sarah's eyes narrowed further. "Well, I asked you a question. What are you doing in this store?" Sophie's heart raced as she struggled to find her voice. The stern look on Sarah's face only made her more nervous, causing her words to come out in a jumbled mess. "I'm waiting for my dad," Sophie stammered, her eyes darting around the store. "He's here somewhere." Sarah's frustration grew with each passing second. "Your father? Where exactly is he? I haven't seen anyone looking for you." Sophie's hands trembled as she tried to explain. "He's checking the store for work. I got lost." Sarah's patience was wearing thin. She took a step closer to Sophie, her voice rising slightly. "That's not a very convincing story. Why don't you tell me what you're really up to?" By now, other customers had started to notice the tense exchange. A few people slowed their carts, pretending to examine nearby products while stealing glances at the scene. Sophie felt the weight of their stares, which only heightened her anxiety. She tried to take a deep breath, but it came out shaky and uneven. Please, she whispered, I'm telling the truth. I just got confused. The store is so big. Sarah wasn't buying it. Her years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now those instincts were telling her that something was wrong. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me, she said firmly, reaching for Sophie's arm. Sophie flinched away, her eyes wide with fear. No, please. I didn't do anything wrong. The commotion was drawing more attention now. An elderly couple whispered to each other, shaking their heads disapprovingly. A young mother pulled her child closer, eyeing the scene warily. Sarah's voice grew louder, her frustration evident. If you've done nothing wrong, then you have nothing to worry about. Now come with me so we can sort this out. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she desperately looked around the store, hoping to catch a glimpse of her father. Dad, she called out weakly, her voice cracking. Dad, where are you? Sarah's patience had reached its limit. Her voice took on a commanding tone as she pointed at Sophie's small shoulder bag. Empty your bag now. Sophie's eyes widened in disbelief. But I didn't take anything, she protested weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. If that's true, then you have nothing to hide, Sarah insisted, her stance rigid and unyielding. Show me what's in your bag. With trembling hands, Sophie fumbled with the zipper of her bag. Her anxiety made her fingers clumsy, and she struggled to open it. The more she fumbled, the more suspicious Sarah became. Come on, hurry up, Sarah urged, her tone sharp with impatience. By now, a small crowd had gathered around them, curious onlookers watching the scene unfold. Sophie could feel their eyes on her, which only made her more nervous. I'm trying, Sophie said, her voice cracking as tears began to form in her eyes. Sarah had been searching through the bag with a sense of urgency. In her haste, she accidentally tipped it over, and the contents spilled out onto the floor. Among the scattered items were a small wallet, a phone, some tissues, and a few other personal belongings. Sarah quickly bent down to inspect the scattered items, her eyes scanning for anything suspicious. Sophie, who had been waiting quietly, now stood frozen and watched helplessly as Sarah rifled through her personal possessions. The onlookers around them began to murmur among themselves. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others whispered their theories about what was happening. Sophie felt exposed and vulnerable, her heart pounding in her chest. She wished she could disappear from the gaze of strangers who were watching her every move. In a trembling voice, she said, See, I told you I didn't take anything. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She stood up with a stern look on her face and demanded, Turn out your pockets. Sophie's hands shook as she complied, pulling out the lining of her empty pockets. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks as she struggled to hold back sobs. The situation had become unbearably uncomfortable for her. Surrounded by strangers who were watching her intently, Sophie felt humiliated and scared. She looked around desperately, hoping to see her father's familiar face in the crowd, but he was nowhere to be seen. As the tense scene unfolded, Mr. Samuel Bennett emerged from the back of the store. He had been inspecting the store for renovations and had noticed the commotion near the front. Seeing his daughter at the center of it all, he quickened his pace, his heart sinking. Sophie, he called out, pushing through the crowd. What's going on here? The sight that greeted him was enough to make his blood boil. His daughter stood trembling, tears streaming down her face, her belongings scattered on the floor. A stern-looking police officer loomed over her, and curious onlookers gawked at the scene. Mr. Bennett's anger flared as he approached. Sophie, sweetheart, he said softly, placing a protective arm around his daughter's shoulders. He turned to Sarah, his eyes flashing with anger and disbelief. Officer, what is the meaning of this? Sarah straightened her posture and addressed Mr. Bennett with a firm tone. Sir, I caught this young woman behaving suspiciously. I have reason to believe she may have been shoplifting. Mr. Bennett's jaw clenched, his voice low and controlled. Shoplifting? My daughter? That's absurd. Sophie would never do such a thing. Sarah maintained her stance. With all due respect, sir, I observed her wandering aimlessly through the store for an extended period. When questioned, she became nervous and evasive. Mr. Bennet looked down at Sophie, who was now clinging to him, her body shaking with silent sobs. He felt a surge of protective anger wash over him. "Officer," he said, his voice rising slightly, "my daughter has social anxiety. She gets nervous in unfamiliar places. I was inspecting the store for renovations and asked her to wait for me. That's all that was happening here." Sarah's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. Even so, her behavior was suspicious enough to warrant an investigation. "I was simply doing my job," she said. Mr. Bennet took a deep breath, struggling to maintain his composure. Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass innocent people based on unfounded suspicions." The onlookers shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement with Mr. Bennet's words. Sarah glanced around, suddenly aware of the crowd's changing mood. "I understand you're upset, sir," Sarah said, her voice losing some of its earlier conviction, "but I had to follow protocol." "Protocol?" Mr. Bennet interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "Is it protocol to publicly humiliate a young girl without any evidence of wrongdoing? To make her empty her bag and turn out her pockets in front of strangers?" He took a deep breath, his anger giving way to weary sadness. "Officer," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I think there's been a big misunderstanding here. Sophie wasn't wandering around because she was up to no good. She was here with me." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "But I didn't see," she started. Mr. Bennet nodded patiently. "I'm here to finalize some renovation plans for the store. Sophie came along to keep me company, but she's not used to places like this." He gently squeezed Sophie's shoulder, and she looked up at him gratefully. "My daughter has social anxiety. How being in busy, unfamiliar places can be overwhelming for her. She was probably just trying to find a quiet spot while waiting for me." As Mr. Bennet spoke, Sarah's stern mask of authority slowly crumbled. She looked at Sophie, really seeing her for the first time, not a suspicious character, but a frightened young woman. I didn't know," Sarah stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating. "I just thought—" Mr. Bennet nodded, his voice softening. "I know what you thought, officer, but sometimes things aren't what they seem at first glance." Sarah's eyes darted between Mr. Friedrich, Bennet, and Sophie, then to the scattered contents of Sophie's bag on the floor. The weight of her actions began to sink in, and a sick feeling grew in the pit of her stomach. "Oh no," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "What have I done?" The crowd around them had grown quiet, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of sympathy and embarrassment. Sarah felt their eyes on her, judging her, and she knew she had made a terrible mistake. As she looked at Sophie's terrified face, the reality of her actions hit her like a ton of bricks. "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She felt a lump forming in her throat as shame washed over her. How could she have been so quick to judge? Mr. Bennet gently stroked Sophie's hair, murmuring soft words of comfort. Then he turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Officer Carter," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I hope you understand the harm that assumptions like yours can cause." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Mr. Bennet continued, "My daughter came here today to spend time with me. Instead, she's been humiliated and scared half to death, all because of how she looks and how her anxiety made her act." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she felt the full impact of her actions. Sarah was deeply affected as she listened to Mr. Bennet. She felt a strong urge to look away and to hide from the truth in his words, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. "This isn't just about today," Mr. Bennet said firmly. "It's about a lifetime of experiences like this. It's about people making snap judgments based solely on appearance and prejudice." Sarah felt as though each word was a physical blow, striking her hard. She had always prided herself on being a good cop, on protecting people, but now she saw that her own biases had turned her into the very kind of threat she had sworn to protect against. Sarah wanted to respond, to say that she never meant to hurt anyone, that she was just doing her job, but the words caught in her throat. She knew that such excuses sounded hollow. Mr. Bennet nodded as if he understood her unspoken thoughts. "I know you didn't set out to cause harm," he said softly. "But that's the thing about prejudice. It doesn't always announce itself. It sneaks in, coloring our perceptions without us even realizing it." Sarah took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to say something, even though every part of her wanted to run away and hide. With shaky legs, she stepped forward to face the small crowd that had gathered around them. "I need to say something," Sarah began, her voice trembling. She turned to Sophie and Mr. Bennet, meeting their eyes with difficulty. "I made a terrible mistake today. I jumped to conclusions based on nothing but my own prejudices, and I hurt you both in the process. I'm so sorry." Sophie's eyes widened in surprise, while Mr. Bennet's expression softened slightly. Sarah's words began to flow faster, driven by the urgency to make things right. "I should never have accused you, Sophie. I should have taken the time to understand instead of making assumptions. My actions were wrong, and they go against everything I should stand for as a police officer." Her voice cracked as she fought back tears. "Mr. Bennet, you're absolutely right about the harm that assumptions like mine can cause. I see that now, and I'm ashamed of my behavior." The crowd around them had fallen silent, listening intently to Sarah's apology. Some people nodded in approval, while others looked on with sympathy. "I want you both to know that I take full responsibility for my actions," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with resolve. "I promise to do better, to learn from this, and to work on confronting my own biases." As Sarah finished speaking, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but along with the relief came a deep, gnawing sense of guilt. How many times had she made similar assumptions in the past? How many people had she hurt without even realizing it? The realization hit her hard. This wasn't just about today. It was about her entire approach to her job and her interactions with the community she was meant to serve. Sarah knew that a simple apology wasn't enough. She needed to change, to grow, to become the kind of officer who truly protected all members of her community. As the crowd began to disperse and Mr. Bennet gently led Sophie away, Sarah stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing with thoughts of how she could make amends, not just to Sophie and Mr. Bennet, but to everyone she had wronged through her biased actions. Sarah left the grocery store feeling dazed, her mind reeling from the events that had just unfolded. As she drove home, the weight of her actions pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. She couldn't shake the image of Sophie's terrified face or the disappointment in Mr. Bennet's eyes. Once home, Sarah collapsed onto her couch, trembling. She buried her face in her hands, tears spilling through her fingers. "How could I have been so wrong?" she whispered to the empty room. As the night wore on, Sarah tossed and turned in bed, unable to find peace. Every time she closed her eyes, memories of her past actions flooded her mind. Faces of people she had stopped, questioned, and treated with suspicion, all based on her own biases. The next morning, Sarah called in sick to work. She couldn't bear the thought of putting on her uniform, not when she felt so unworthy of it. Instead, she spent the day reviewing her past cases, her stomach churning as she recognized patterns in her behavior that she had never noticed before. By the third day, Sarah realized she needed more time to process everything. She requested a week off from her captain, who agreed, understanding the distress in her voice. With the time stretching before her, Sarah decided to use it wisely. She began researching bias in policing, reading articles, and watching documentaries that exposed systemic issues she had been part of. Each new piece of information felt like a punch to the gut, But Sarah forced herself to keep going. She started journaling, pouring out her thoughts and feelings onto paper. As she wrote, Sarah began to see a path forward, a way to not only change herself, but to potentially make a difference in her department. "I can't undo what I've done," Sarah wrote one evening, her pen flying across the page. "But I can learn from it. I can do better. I have to do better." With a trembling hand, Sarah knocked on the Bennetts' front door, her heart racing as she prepared to make amends. As she waited, she wondered if they would even want to see her. After what felt like forever, the door opened, and Mr. Bennett was there. "Officer Carter," he said calmly. Sarah felt nervous and said, "Mr. Bennett, I came to say sorry again. I know it doesn't change what happened, but I needed to say it to you in person." Mr. Bennett looked at her for a moment and then nodded slowly. "Come in," he said, moving aside. Sarah followed him into a cozy living room and sat on the sofa. Mr. Bennett sat in an armchair across from her, watching her closely. "Mr. Bennett, I'm really sorry for what I did to Sophie," Sarah said, her voice full of emotion. "I've been thinking a lot, and I realize now how wrong I was." Mr. Bennett leaned forward, his hands together. "What happened to Sophie wasn't just a one-time thing," he said. "It's part of a bigger problem we face every day. We always wake up knowing people might judge or question us just because of our skin color. It wears us down a little bit at a time." Sarah listened, feeling sad as Mr. Bennett shared stories of the problems his family had faced. He talked about job interviews that never worked out, being followed in stores, and the fear of being stopped by the police. "And Sophie," Mr. Bennett said softly, "she's seen all of this since she was little. It has made her very anxious and scared in public." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she began to understand how her actions and the system she was part of had affected Sophie. Mr. Bennett sat back, looking distant as he remembered when Sophie was a child. "When Sophie was just 6, we took her to the park for her birthday picnic," he said softly. "She was so excited to play with other kids. But when we got there, the other parents told their kids to leave. One mother even told her daughter not to play with those people. Sophie didn't understand why no one wanted to be her friend." Sarah felt a lump in her throat, imagining little Sophie being hurt on what should have been a fun day. Mr. Bennett continued sharing stories. He told Sarah about Sophie's first day of school, when the teacher thought she couldn't read well, and how a store clerk followed Sophie around, thinking she was stealing when she was just buying a gift for her mom. She saw how these experiences made Sophie more anxious and less confident. By the time Sophie reached high school, Mr. Bennett said sadly, she had learned to keep herself as small and unnoticed as possible. She stopped raising her hand in class, even when she knew the answers, and avoided crowded places because she was scared of drawing attention to herself. Sarah's tears fell as she thought about her own actions in the store and how she added to Sophie's pain. "Mr. Bennett," Sarah whispered, "I didn't know. I'm so sorry." Mr. Bennett nodded, understanding. "It's not just about one thing, Officer Carter. It's about a lifetime of experiences that made Sophie afraid of the world." As Sarah listened, she felt something change inside her, realizing the weight of her actions and the impact of the stories. Sarah had a meaningful conversation with Mr. Bennett that left a lasting impact on her. She realized that just feeling sorry for past mistakes wasn't enough. She needed to do something about it and be a better person. With her mind still buzzing from their talk, Sarah returned home and sat down at her kitchen table. She stared at her laptop screen, feeling both determined and anxious. With a deep breath, she typed "effects of racial discrimination" into the search bar. As the search results appeared, Sarah clicked on the first article titled "The Long-Lasting Impact of Racial Bias." As she read, her eyes widened. The article explained how constant racial discrimination could have severe psychological effects, such as causing anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues. This information hit Sarah hard, and she felt a growing sense of urgency to understand more. Sarah dove deeper into her research, discovering documentaries that shared real-life stories of people who had faced racial profiling. The more she watched, the more emotional she became. Tears streamed down her face as she connected the stories to her friend Leah's experiences. One particular documentary featured a young black man who described being followed in stores, which reminded Sarah of the way she had treated Leah. It hit her hard to think she might have caused similar pain without realizing it. Hours passed as Sarah continued her search. She read articles, watched videos, and learned about concepts like microaggressions, systemic racism, and white privilege. Each new piece of information shifted her perspective, opening her eyes to realities she had never fully acknowledged before. As the night wore on, Sarah found a website about implicit bias and decided to take a test. The results were shocking and unsettling, but instead of feeling defensive, Sarah felt motivated to change. Determined to make a difference, Sarah scribbled notes, bookmarked useful pages, and created a reading list for herself. She was resolved to continue her journey of education and self-reflection. As she learned more about the experiences of those she had wrongfully judged in the past, her worldview began to transform. One day, Sarah found herself standing nervously at the entrance of the community center. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her shirt as she took a deep breath and pushed open the door. She stepped into a room filled with people from diverse backgrounds. The room fell silent as people turned to look at her, and Sarah felt a wave of discomfort wash over her. She spotted an empty chair near the back and quickly made her way to it, trying to avoid eye contact. The meeting began, and Sarah listened intently as community members shared their experiences. A young man recounted a recent encounter with the police that left him feeling humiliated and scared. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized some of her own past behaviors in the officer's actions. As the meeting progressed, Sarah became more engaged, leaning forward in her chair and hanging on every word. The stories shared were eye-opening, revealing a side of the community she had never truly seen before. During a break, Sarah hesitantly approached a small group of people. Her voice was shaky but determined as she introduced herself and said, "I'm here to learn. I want to understand how I can be a better officer for this community." The group welcomed her, though some remained cautious. An older woman named Miss Patel smiled warmly at Sarah and said, "It takes courage to come here and listen. We appreciate that you're trying to understand." Over the next few weeks, Sarah continued to attend meetings and events. Each time, she felt a little more comfortable and began to recognize familiar faces. She engaged in deeper conversations and listened to stories of struggle, resilience, and hope. At one event, Sarah participated in a discussion about police reform. Instead of becoming defensive, she listened carefully to the concerns raised and shared her own experiences, admitting to her past mistakes. The conversation was difficult but productive, leaving Sarah feeling both challenged and inspired. As her involvement in the community grew, Sarah's resolve to become a better officer strengthened. She began to view her role not just as an enforcer of laws, but as a protector and supporter of all people. One day, she took a deep breath and stood outside Sergeant Harris's office, her heart racing. She knew this conversation was important. She knocked on the door and stepped inside. "Sergeant Harris, do you have a moment?" "I need to talk to you about something important," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her nerves. Sergeant Harris looked up from his paperwork, noticing the serious expression on her face. "Of course, Officer Carter. Have a seat," he replied. Sarah sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She took another deep breath and began, "Sir, I made a mistake recently at the local grocery store. I let my biases cloud my judgment and wrongly accused someone of shoplifting." She recounted the incident with Sophie Bennett, her voice trembling slightly, as she described her actions and the hurt she had caused. "I've been attending community meetings and events," Sarah continued. "I'm trying to learn and understand better. I wanted you to know about this incident and my efforts to improve." Sergeant Harris listened intently, his expression softening. When Sarah finished, he nodded slowly and said, "Officer Carter, I appreciate your honesty. It takes a lot of courage to admit to a mistake like this." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She knew that her journey towards becoming a better person and officer was just beginning, but she felt hopeful and determined. Sergeant Harris told Sarah he was very happy with how she was trying to change and get better. He said this kind of self-reflection was important for their police department and thanked her. Sarah, speaking softly, said she was thankful for his support. Sergeant Harris told her she had his full support and that if she needed help or resources, she should ask. Sarah nodded, feeling thankful and determined. As Sarah continued her journey, she wanted to be more involved with her community. One sunny Saturday, she went to the local community center and felt nervous but excited. Miss Patel, the center's coordinator, greeted her warmly and asked if she was ready to help. Sarah said yes and was ready to do anything she could. Over the next few weeks, Sarah became a regular volunteer at the center. She helped serve meals to older people, tutored kids who needed extra help, and organized a clothing drive for families in need. With each day, she felt more open-hearted towards people she had once been suspicious of. One day, while helping a young boy with his math homework, his mother thanked her. She said she never thought a police officer would do something like that, and Sarah felt very emotional. She said she was just trying to do what was right. Sarah also started going to workshops about being inclusive and understanding biases. At first, she felt out of place among social workers and community leaders, but she began to understand her own past mistakes as she listened to their stories. In one workshop, she shared a moment when she realized her own biases, talking about the incident with Sophie at the grocery store. She felt lighter as she spoke and said that moment made her realize she had to do better for everyone in the community. As time went by, Sarah changed. She smiled more, listened better, and felt more empathy. Her coworkers noticed too and commented on her improved attitude. Sarah went back to the grocery store where her journey of self-reflection began. Felt uncomfortable, but she wanted to make things right. She asked the store manager, Mr. Carter, if she could help out there. Mr. Carter agreed, and from then on, Sarah was a familiar face at the store. She helped elderly customers reach items on high shelves, assisted parents with fussy children, and did small acts of kindness. She wore casual clothes instead of her uniform, but her kindness showed clearly. One day, Sarah saw a young woman who looked lost in the produce section. Instead of jumping to conclusions, she approached with a friendly smile and asked if she could help. The woman was relieved and said she was new in town and needed to find the organic section. Sarah was happy to help and showed her around. As weeks went by, regular customers and store employees noticed Sarah's kindness. They smiled and waved at her, and some stopped to chat. They saw how she patiently helped a mother calm her crying toddler and took extra time to explain product labels to an elderly gentleman. Mr. Carter noticed that Sarah was making a big difference at the grocery store. He told her that the store felt friendlier and more like a community since she started helping. Sarah felt happy and hopeful because she knew she still needed to learn more, but it was nice to hear that her efforts were working. One quiet day, Sarah saw a young man looking confused in the store. She went up to him gently and asked if he needed help. The man said he couldn't find the cereal he wanted because there were so many choices. Sarah smiled and said they could find it together. As they walked, Sarah shared that she used to think everyone should handle busy places easily, but learned that everyone has different challenges. She told him about a time she made a mistake by judging someone and how it taught her to be more understanding and kind. When they found the cereal, the man thanked Sarah. She felt happy knowing she could help. Over time, Sarah became known as the person who could help anyone who felt nervous or lost in the store. She used her own experiences to connect with others and spread kindness. She would tell people that everyone is different, and that's what makes their community special. As months passed, Sarah changed a lot. She became warmer and kinder, and people noticed. They started inviting her to neighborhood parties and meetings. She learned a lot from these interactions and became friends with many people she had once been suspicious of. One day, Mr. King told Sarah she had become a valuable part of the community and that her change showed everyone that it's possible to improve. Sarah realized that her job as a police officer was not just about enforcing rules, but about bringing people together and making her community feel united. She understood that her journey wasn't just about fixing past mistakes, but using her position to help and promote peace. One day, while helping with a community garden project, Sarah heard people talking about how much she had changed. They said she had become a positive influence. Sarah felt proud knowing her efforts were noticed and appreciated. Sophie and Mr. Bennett had been watching Sarah's progress and saw how much she had changed. One evening, Mr. Bennett talked to Sophie about reaching out to Sarah because they had seen her become a better person. Sophie thought about the day at the grocery store, but remembered how much Sarah had improved. Sophie heard that Sarah was trying really hard to help people and make up for her mistakes. "You're right, Dad," Sophie said, her voice getting stronger. "I think it's time to give her a chance. She's really trying to do better." Mr. Richard held Sophie's hand and felt proud of her. "How about we invite her over for dinner next week? It would be a good chance to talk and show her that we notice the good things she's doing." Sophie nodded, smiling a little. "That sounds like a great idea, Dad. I'm ready to give her a chance." At their home, the smell of a nice meal filled the air as Mr. Richard and Sophie got ready for their guest. Sophie's hands shook a little as she set the table. She still felt nervous from what happened at the store, but her dad helped her feel calm. When the doorbell rang, Mr. Richard opened the door with a big smile. "Welcome to our home, Officer Carter," he said, letting Sarah in. Sarah had flowers in her hands and thanked them. "Please call me Sarah," she said warmly. As they ate, the initial awkwardness slowly went away. Mr. Richard asked Sarah about her work in the community. Sarah shared with excitement, "It's been a big learning experience for me. I've met so many people, and it's changed how I see my job." Sophie, who had been quiet, finally spoke up. "I've heard about what you're doing," she said softly. "The community center said you're helping people with social anxieties." Sarah looked at Sophie with care. "Yes, it's important to me to understand and help people who might be in tough situations like yours." Sophie took a deep breath and said, "I appreciate your effort to change. It means a lot to see you taking responsibility." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I'm really sorry for what happened that day. Your forgiveness means so much to me." Mr. Richard felt proud as he watched the exchange. "Sarah, your work is making a difference. People see the change, and it's inspiring others to be more understanding and kind." Sarah wiped away a tear, feeling touched by the kindness she was receiving. "Thank you both for giving me this chance. I promise to keep working hard to make our community better." As dinner continued, Mr. Richard became more serious. "Sarah, while we appreciate your efforts, Sophie still faces challenges every day." Sarah nodded, showing concern. "I'd like to hear more about that if you're willing to share." Mr. Richard looked at Sophie, who nodded a little. He continued, "Sophie deals with everyday tasks that can be very hard for her. For example, going to the store was a big step for her. She tries hard, but sometimes feels like she's moving backward." Sophie added softly, I'm trying to find a job, but interviews scare me. Sarah thought for a moment and then said, "Have you thought about working with animals? The local shelter always needs kind people to help with the animals." Sophie's face brightened up. "I love animals. They don't judge, right?" Mr. Richards smiled at Sophie's excitement. "That's a great idea, Sarah. We'll look into it." Sarah felt happy seeing the positive impact of her idea. "If you'd like, I can introduce you to the shelter manager. She's very kind and understanding." Sophie was excited. That would be amazing. Mr. Richard thanked Sarah. "Your support means a lot to us. It's wonderful to see how much you've grown." Sarah felt tears again and said, "I'm just grateful for the chance to make things right. If you need anything, just ask." As the evening went on, everyone talked more comfortably. Sarah listened with empathy, feeling grateful for the chance to make a difference. Sarah had been talking to the Bennett family, who shared their daily struggles and small wins. She felt so much empathy for them that she wanted to make a bigger difference. The next day, she went to Sergeant Harris with new ideas. "Sergeant, I think we should help our police officers understand and connect better with the community," Sarah said excitedly. Sergeant Harris was interested and asked how to do it. Sarah suggested more training on understanding biases and how to engage with people. They worked together to set up a new program with experts and community leaders, and Sarah used her experience with Laya as an example. As the new training started, Sarah led the discussions and activities. She was happy to see her fellow officers talking about their biases and thinking of ways to build trust with the community. One day, Officer Martinez told Sarah that he used to think she was just a strict officer, but now he saw things differently. Sarah was pleased and agreed that learning together was what mattered. Over time, Sarah noticed that her colleagues were becoming more patient and understanding. The community noticed these changes and gave positive feedback. Sarah felt proud and fulfilled. Her transformation from a strict officer to a caring one was noticed, and other officers began to seek her advice. One young officer, Ryan, asked Sarah for help because he was struggling with some patrol situations. Sarah advised him to approach every situation with empathy and to really listen to people. Word spread about Sarah's willingness to help, and soon many officers wanted to learn from her. Sarah organized meetings where they could talk about tough situations and find better ways to handle them. During one meeting, Officer Maria Lopez shared a story about almost giving tickets to teenagers, but then realizing they were just waiting for their parents after an event. Sarah was pleased, and said that every interaction is a chance to build trust and understanding. As time went on, the atmosphere in the precinct improved. Officers shared more positive stories, and complaints against the department went down. Sarah felt a strong sense of purpose and pride in the changes they had made. Sarah was patrolling the busy streets near the mall when she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. A mother and her young child were sitting by the entrance, holding a cardboard sign that asked for help. In the past, Sarah would have immediately told them to leave because of the rules about loitering and panhandling. But today, things felt different. With her new perspective and understanding, she saw their situation through a lens of compassion. She parked her patrol car and approached them slowly, careful not to startle them. The mother's eyes widened with fear as she noticed the officer walking closer. She instinctively pulled her child closer to her side. Sarah stopped a few steps away and crouched down to their level, trying to be as non-threatening as possible. "Hi, I'm Officer Carter," she said softly. "Is everything okay? Can I help you with anything?" Her voice was gentle, and she tried to reassure them with her calm demeanor. The mother, whose name was Rachel, looked up at Sarah with tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry, officer. We'll move along. We have nowhere else to go," she said, her voice trembling. Sarah's heart clenched at the pain in Rachel's voice. It was clear that they were in a desperate situation. "It's all right," Sarah said, trying to comfort her. "I'm not here to make you leave. I want to help if I can. Can you tell me what's going on?" Rachel began to share her story through tears and halting words. She explained how she had lost her job, then her apartment, and now found herself on the streets with her 5-year-old son, Ben. As Sarah listened, she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She remembered how differently she would have handled this situation just a few months ago. The realization of her change made her even more determined to offer help. "There are resources available to help you and Ben," Sarah said gently. "Would you be willing to let me make a few calls and see what we can do?" Rachel nodded hesitantly, a flicker of hope appearing in her eyes for the first time. Sarah spent the next hour making calls to local shelters and social services. She used her connections to find a safe place for Rachel and Ben to stay. It was clear to everyone in the community that Sarah had transformed, especially at the grocery store where her journey of change had begun. Every Saturday morning, Sarah would arrive at the store not in her police uniform, but in casual clothes with a warm smile on her face. The store manager, Mr. Patel, would greet her with a friendly nod. "Good morning, Sarah. Glad to have you here again," he would say, handing her a clipboard. "Happy to be here, Mr. Patel," Sarah would reply, her eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. As she made her way through the aisles, she kept an eye out for anyone who might need assistance. She spotted an elderly woman struggling to reach a can on a high shelf. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," Sarah offered, easily retrieving the item. The woman beamed at her and said, "Thank you, dear. You're always so helpful." Sarah chatted with her for a few moments, making sure she had everything she needed before moving on. As she walked, Sarah overheard a heated argument between two customers over the last carton of milk. Drawing on her police training and newfound empathy, Sarah approached the pair. "Gentlemen, is everything all right here?" she asked calmly. The men recognized Sarah and lowered their voices. Sarah listened to both sides of the argument and suggested a compromise that left both customers satisfied. As they walked away, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on how different this interaction was from her confrontation with Sophie months ago. Throughout the day, Sarah helped customers find items, assisted with bagging groceries, and even shared stories of her personal growth with those who asked. Her presence seemed to create a ripple effect of kindness and understanding throughout the store. As the day wound down, a young black teenager entered the store looking nervous and out of place. Sarah recognized the look of anxiety on his face and approached him with a gentle smile. "Hi there," she said softly. "I'm Sarah. Is there anything I can help you find today?" The teenager, initially wary, relaxed a bit at Sarah's friendly demeanor. "I'm looking for ingredients for my mom's birthday cake," he admitted shyly. "That's wonderful," Sarah exclaimed. "Let's see if we can find everything you need." As they walked through the store together, Sarah shared a bit about her own journey of learning and growth. The teenager listened intently, visibly becoming more comfortable as they talked. As summer drew to a close, Sarah Collins stood nervously in front of the police department. Colleagues and community members were gathered for a special ceremony. Chief Daniels, a tall man with graying hair, stepped up to the podium. "Today, we're here to recognize one of our own," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Officer Sarah Collins has shown us what it truly means to serve and protect." Sarah's heart raced as she listened to the chief recount her journey. He spoke of her volunteer work, her efforts to bridge gaps between the police and the community, and her dedication to fostering inclusivity. Officer Carter's commitment to change has not only transformed her as an individual, but has also inspired our entire department, Chief Daniels continued. Sarah glanced around and saw familiar faces in the crowd, feeling proud of the positive impact she had made. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett stood proudly at the front. Sophie, looking confident, waved to Sarah. Chief Daniels announced, I am proud to give Officer Sarah Collins an award for helping the community and being inclusive. The crowd clapped loudly as Sarah walked up to get her award. Her hands shook a little because she was so happy. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice trembling with emotion. "This journey has taught me a lot about what it means to help and be part of a community. I promise to keep working hard to make everyone feel included." As Sarah stepped back, her fellow officers congratulated her and patted her on the back. Sergeant Harris smiled at her and said, "You've come a long way, Carter. Your hard work has helped us make new training programs." Sarah felt proud knowing her efforts were making a difference. After the ceremony, community members came to shake her hand and thank her. As time went on, Sophie started visiting the community center where Sarah volunteered. Sophie, who used to be shy, was inspired by Sarah's journey. One sunny day, Sophie took a deep breath and went into the center. Sarah was happy to see her and said, "Sophie, it's great to see you here." Sophie nervously asked if she could help out. Sarah was excited and said, "We always need volunteers. Do you have any ideas?" Sophie hesitated and then said, "Maybe we could help people with social anxiety, like I had." Sarah smiled and said, "That's a great idea. Your experience can really help others." Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Sophie worked together to start a support group for people with social anxiety. They made a safe space where people could share their stories and learn how to cope. Sophie was surprised at how much she enjoyed helping others. Her confidence grew each day. Sarah watched proudly as Sophie became more confident and spoke in front of the group, sharing her story. During a session, Sophie spoke to the group about overcoming anxiety and taking small steps for big changes. Sarah felt emotional seeing how far Sophie had come. After the session, Sarah told Sophie she did a great job. Sophie's eyes filled with tears of joy as she said, "I couldn't have done it without you, Sarah. Your support changed everything for me." At the Unity Day celebration, Sarah and Sophie were the focus of the event. Sarah thought about how she had changed from being a biased officer to someone who understood others. When it was Sophie's turn to speak, she spoke confidently and thanked Sarah for her help. Sophie said that Sarah's change helped everyone learn to understand each other. As Sophie spoke, many people, including Sarah, cried. Sophie finished her speech, and the whole community gave a standing ovation. Everyone felt a strong sense of togetherness, showing that real change starts with understanding and kindness. Would you give Officer Sarah Collins a second chance if you were Sophie? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I work hard to write these touching stories for you, and your support keeps me going.